The wind, a constant biting presence on the high plains, whipped around Clara's small cabin, rattling the single glass pane in the window like a nervous guest. It carried the scent of dust and distance, the emptiness of the world stretching away to the bruised horizon. Back in the year 1874, loneliness was not just a feeling, it was a physical weight, a shroud woven from miles of isolation and the quiet echo of a life that was no longer. Clara knew that weight intimately. It pressed down on her shoulders as she stoked the meager fire, watched the last light drain from the sky, and listened to the wind howl like a thing grieving alongside her. 3 years had passed since the fever took Thomas, leaving her alone on this unforgiving piece of land he had claimed with such fierce, hopeful energy. The energy was gone now, replaced by the slow, weary rhythm of survival. Chop wood, haul water, tend the stubborn patch of earth that grudgingly yielded beans and potatoes. Try not to think about the laughter that used to fill these walls, the call of his voice, the warmth of his hand in hers. Grief was a silent partner in every chore, a shadow that lengthened with the endless days. She was 27, a widow in a land that had little patience for vulnerability, especially not a woman's. The few settlers scattered across this remote territory were wary, their faces etched with suspicion born of hardship and the ever-present fear of the unknown. They saw her as an anomaly, perhaps a target, or worse, a woman who might need help they couldn't spare. She kept to herself, a ghost on the prairie, and they did the same. It was a brittle, unspoken agreement forged in the crucible of the frontier. Her cabin was small, just 2 rooms, built solid and low against the wind. Inside, it held the sparse necessities of her existence and the heavy silence of memory. Thomas's worn coat still hung on a peg by the door. His axe, handle smoothed by his grip, leaned against the wall outside. Every object was a small, sharp reminder of what was lost. She had built a wall around her heart, stone by careful stone, against the relentless tide of pain and the indifferent vastness of the prairie. She did what needed to be done, day after day, her movements economical, her face a mask of stoic endurance. There was no one to witness the moments the mask slipped, when a wave of sorrow threatened to drown her, or the quiet desperation that sometimes clawed at her throat in the dead of night. This land demanded everything and gave little back, save for the fierce, unyielding beauty of the wide-open sky and the brutal honesty of nature. It shaped those who stayed, filing away softness, leaving only the core of bone and will. Clara felt herself being shaped, ground down by the elements and the solitude, becoming as spare and tough as the prairie grass. There was no room for weakness, no space for tears. There was only the next sunrise, the next chore, the next breath. One afternoon, the wind carried a different sound, something other than its usual mournful song, a distant murmur, then shouts, sharp and ragged, cutting through the air. Clara paused, her hands stilling over the laundry she was rinsing in the creek. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Trouble rarely visited her isolated corner of the world, and when it did, it was seldom good. She crept to the edge of the small rise that overlooked the trail leading towards the distant, rough-hewn settlement. What she saw froze her blood. A small group of riders, maybe 4 or 5, were gathered by a stand of cottonwoods barely a quarter-mile from her property line. They were settlers, recognizable by their dusty clothes and the grim set of their shoulders, and they had someone with them, a man, tied to the sturdy trunk of a tree. Even from this distance, Clara could see the dark skin, the long braid of black hair, a Native American. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her practiced stoicism. The tension between the settlers and the native tribes in the territory was a constant, low-burning fire, occasionally flaring into violence. Stories of raids, retaliations, and cruelty were whispered around rare campfires, shaping the fear that kept neighbors distant. This man was an enemy to the settlers, a threat, captured and awaiting. She didn't need to guess what came next. They were leaving him. Leaving him tied there, under the hot sun, vulnerable, a warning perhaps, a slow, public death. She watched as the settlers finished their grim work, their movements curt and final. They mounted their horses, casting not a single glance towards her cabin. Then they rode away, their figures shrinking against the vastness, their shouts fading into the wind's mournful cry. Silence descended again, broken only by the wind, and the distant, frantic beating of her own heart. He was still there, tied to the tree, alone, dying slowly. The sun beat down, relentless. Thirst would be his first torment, then the sunstroke, the exposure. It was a cruel fate, even for an enemy. All the ingrained fear, the warnings she'd heard since childhood, the raw, territorial mistrust that permeated the frontier, screamed at her to turn away, to go back inside, to pretend she hadn't seen. This was not her concern. This was dangerous. This was tribal business, settler business, a conflict she had no part in. But something else stirred within her, something buried deep beneath the layers of grief and fear, a flicker of shared humanity perhaps. Or the raw, aching memory of her own helplessness when Thomas was dying, when there was nothing she could do, nothing anyone could do. This man was suffering, utterly at the mercy of the sun and his bonds. He was, in this moment, simply a man in pain. She waited until the riders were well out of sight, swallowed by the rolling landscape. The sun crept higher in the sky. She knew she couldn't leave him there. The knowledge settled heavy and certain in her gut, overriding the clamor of her fear. It was an act of defiance, a dangerous, forbidden kindness that went against every rule of survival she had learned. But the alternative, the image of him dying slowly under the sun while she sat safe in her cabin, was a weight her soul couldn't bear. She gathered her courage, took a deep breath that tasted of dust and dread, and walked back towards the creek. She filled a dipper with cool, clear water. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up a knife from the workbench by the cabin door. She hesitated for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down. Then, setting her jaw, she started walking towards the cottonwood stand. As she approached, the details became sharper, more immediate. He was younger than she had expected, lean and muscular, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. His eyes, dark and intense, were fixed on her, wary and unreadable, like a wild animal cornered but still capable of defiance. He was bruised, his face cut in places, his traditional clothing torn. He wore a single feather in his hair, now slightly askew. He was undeniably a warrior, even stripped of his weapons and bound. Pride, raw and unbroken, was still evident in the rigid set of his shoulders, the unwavering gaze he held her with. He looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. Surprise, perhaps? Resignation? She stopped a few feet away, the dipper of water held out slightly. The tension crackled between them, thick and silent. He said nothing, just watched her, his eyes tracking her every movement. She could feel the palpable strength emanating from him despite his weakened state. This was the enemy, the other. And yet in his eyes she saw only a reflection of the stark landscape and the shared human experience of suffering. "Water," she said, her voice raspy, unused to speaking aloud. "For you." He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her words, which he likely didn't understand anyway. His gaze remained fixed on her, assessing, calculating. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken history, with the conflict that lay between their worlds. She held the dipper steady, her arm beginning to ache. It was a small offering, a simple act, but here, in this place, it felt monumental, forbidden. Finally, slowly, his head dipped in a fraction of a nod. Acknowledgement, acceptance, tentative, wary. Clara stepped closer, kneeling carefully in the dry grass. She raised the dipper to his lips. His eyes never left hers, still sharp with vigilance, but his mouth, cracked and dry, parted slightly. He drank, long and deep, the water tracing paths through the dust on his skin. His throat worked visibly. When he finished, he pulled back, letting out a slow, steadying breath. He still didn't speak. She lowered the dipper, her gaze drifting to the rawhide ropes binding him tightly to the tree. They were thick, expertly tied. His wrists were already raw, chafed by his struggles against the unyielding bonds. This wasn't just about water. Leaving him tied here was a death sentence, a slow, agonizing one. The fear returned, whispering insidious warnings in her ear. "Turn back. It's not too late. Walk away. Let nature take its course. It's expected. It's safer." But she looked at his face, at the stark dignity etched there, the vulnerability held at bay by sheer force of will, and she knew she couldn't leave him. It was illogical, dangerous, insane. But the choice was already made, deep inside her, in that place where grief had hollowed out space for a fragile seed of reckless compassion. She met his gaze again. I'll cut you loose," she said, her voice low. He still didn't understand the words, but her intention must have been clear from the knife in her hand, the look on her face. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, quickly masked. The vigilance remained, but something else softened around the edges of his eyes. She knelt again, sawed carefully at the rawhide binding his wrists. It was tough, stretched taut. The knife blade bit slowly, requiring patience and effort. He watched her work, silent, unmoving. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the tension in his bound muscles. The air felt charged, thick with unspoken questions and potential threats. Finally, with a final slice, the rope gave way. His hands dropped to his lap, stiff and bruised, rubbed raw. He flexed his fingers slowly, testing their freedom. She moved to his ankles, cutting those bonds as well. When he was entirely free, he didn't immediately spring up. He sat there for a moment, rubbing his wrists, watching her with that same intense, assessing gaze. You are hurt," she said, gesturing tentatively towards the cuts and bruises. He understood the gesture, if not the words. He nodded slightly, a grimace touching his lips. He reached up, touched the cut on his cheekbone, then winced. "My cabin is small," she said, speaking slowly, simply, hoping he might grasp some meaning. "But, safe from the sun, you can rest there for a short time." It was the most reckless offer she had ever made, hiding a warrior of a tribe her neighbors feared above all else. It was an act punishable, she was sure, by severe retribution if discovered. But the alternative was unthinkable. He looked from her face to the distant line of trees, then back to her. He seemed to weigh the offer, the risk, the strange, unexpected kindness. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind and the whisper of the leaves overhead. He pushed himself slowly to his feet, favoring one leg. He was taller up close, his presence commanding despite his injuries. He still held that fierce pride, but beneath it, she saw the exhaustion, the pain. He pointed towards her cabin, then to himself, then back to her. He touched his chest, then gestured between them. It was a question. "Me, your place, us?" She nodded, a lump in her throat. "Yes." He studied her face for another long moment, searching, she suspected, for treachery or fear. But all he would find there was a weary resolve, a flicker of defiance against the world's cruelty, and a strange, nascent sense of having crossed a line she could never uncross. Finally, he gave another small, decisive nod. "Kaelen," he said, the word rough, low. He touched his chest again. Clara understood. Her name, Clara, she replied, touching her own chest. He tested his injured leg, took a tentative step. He moved with the grace of a predator, even wounded. She turned, gesturing for him to follow. She didn't look back to see if he was coming. She just walked towards her small cabin, towards the unimaginable risk she had just invited into her solitary life. He followed. She could hear the soft tread of his feet on the dry ground behind her. She didn't know what she was doing. She only knew that she was doing it. Inside the cabin, the air felt thick with unspoken tension. Kaelen stood just inside the door, his eyes sweeping over the sparse room, taking in the details, the rough-hewn table, the cot covered with a worn quilt, the small cooking fireplace, the few dishes on a shelf. It must have seemed alien, primitive perhaps, compared to his own world. He was bleeding from a cut on his thigh, the torn fabric soaked dark. "You are hurt," she repeated, gesturing. She found a clean cloth, some warm water. She hesitated, unsure if he would allow her to touch him. He watched her, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he sat down on the floor, extending his injured leg. He pulled back the torn fabric. The wound was deep, jagged. It needed cleaning, binding. Clara knelt beside him, her hands steady despite the tremor in her stomach. This was nursing Thomas, but with the added layer of fear and cultural distance. She cleaned the wound as best she could, rinsing away the dirt and blood. He watched her face the whole time, his eyes intense, but he didn't flinch or pull away. His stoicism was absolute. When she finished, she tore strips of an old sheet and carefully bound the wound. Her fingers brushed his skin, warm and taut. It felt strange, intimate, terrifying. He remained still, a statue carved from dark wood and quiet strength. "You need rest," she said, gesturing towards the cot. He looked at the cot, then back at her. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in his expression. Gratitude, maybe? Or just acceptance of necessity. He pushed himself up, moving stiffly, and lay down on the narrow cot. He lay on his back, arms crossed over his chest, eyes open, still watchful. He was a warrior, even in repose, even in this strange alien shelter. Clara moved about the cabin, trying to appear normal, trying to ignore the dangerous presence filling her small space. She stoked the fire, prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. The silence was different now. It was no longer the empty silence of her loneliness, but a charged silence, filled with the presence of another being, a watchful, unpredictable presence. She ate her meal, sitting at the table, while he lay on the cot, his gaze occasionally flickering towards her. She offered him some of the beans, but he shook his head. He hadn't spoken another word since saying his name. The language barrier was immense, a vast canyon between their worlds, just like the cultural one. As night fell, the cabin became a small island of flickering light in the immense darkness of the prairie. The wind picked up again, whining around the corners, shaking the walls. Clara banked the fire, laid out a blanket on the floor near the hearth for herself. The cot was his for the night. She didn't know about tomorrow. She couldn't think about tomorrow. She lay on the floor, wrapped in the blanket, acutely aware of the man on the cot. She could hear his quiet breathing, the rustle of the quilt as he shifted. Sleep was impossible. Her mind raced with the implications of her actions. Discovery meant disaster, not just for her but for him. And the settlers who had left him, they would be back, or send others. They would not leave their task unfinished. She had placed herself in unimaginable peril. Yet beneath the fear, there was a strange sense of calm. She had acted. She had chosen compassion over fear, humanity over tribal animosity. It was a tiny, rebellious spark in the vast, indifferent darkness. She must have slept eventually, because she woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the window. Kaelen was no longer on the cot. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had he gone? Or worse? He was standing by the window, looking out at the sunrise painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. He held Thomas's axe in his hand, testing its weight. Clara froze, every muscle tensed. The axe. Thomas's axe. He turned then, meeting her gaze. His expression was calm, unthreatening. He nodded towards the axe, then back towards the window, towards the world outside. His gaze was questioning. Outside, chopping. He needed to repay the kindness, perhaps. Or simply needed to move, to do something useful despite his injury. Clara nodded slowly. Yes, would. He understood. He gave her a small, respectful nod, his eyes holding hers for a moment. There was something in that look, a depth of understanding that transcended words. He stepped outside, moving carefully, favoring his leg. Clara watched him go, a mixture of apprehension and something akin to wonder swirling inside her. This warrior, this enemy, was going to chop her wood. He worked slowly at first, the axe strokes measured, cautious of his leg. But even wounded, he moved with a quiet power she had rarely seen. He was efficient, splitting the logs with clean, economical swings. Clara watched him from the doorway, the rising sun warming her face. It felt surreal, this quiet shared existence with a man who should have been her adversary. Over the next few days, a rhythm settled between them, tentative and wordless for the most part. Clara tended his wound. It was healing slowly, but surely. She cooked, cleaned, did her chores. Kaelen, when he wasn't resting, did what he could, chopping wood, repairing a loose fence post, sitting outside keeping a silent watch. They communicated through gestures, expressions, the shared understanding of tasks that needed doing. He learned to point at things and say the Lakota words, MNI for water, Chan for wood, Wigwash for cabin. Clara tried to repeat them, clumsy and unsure. She taught him her words, water, wood, house. He picked them up quickly, his dark eyes sharp and intelligent. He watched her constantly, his gaze intense but no longer wary. He watched her face as she kneaded dough, her hands roughened by work. He watched her mend her dress by the firelight. He watched the way she moved through her world, quiet, resilient. She, in turn, watched him. She saw the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his eyes held a deep, ancient sadness when he thought she wasn't looking, a mirror to her own buried grief. She saw the quiet strength in his injured body, the dignity that never left him. One evening, as they sat across from each other by the fire, he on the cot, she on her blanket, she finally gathered the courage to ask, not in words, but in gesture, about his people. She pointed towards the west, made a sweeping motion with her hand, like many people. Then she drew a line across her throat, mimed being tied, pointed at the settlers. He understood. His face grew serious, guarded. He spoke then, a string of Lakota words, his voice low and resonant. He gestured towards the west, pointed to himself, then held up 4 fingers. Then he mimed riding, and pointed at her cabin. His people were far west, 4 days' ride perhaps. He had been separated, captured near here. He pointed to the rope burns on his wrists, then made a cutting motion with his hand, pointing at her and the knife. Then he placed his hand over his heart, looking at her. Gratitude. Deep, silent gratitude. He pointed to himself again, then to the settlers' trail, made a motion of disappearance. Then he pointed at her, then at the cabin. Danger, hiding. He drew a hand across his own neck, then towards the trail. Death if found. He knew the risk she was taking. The knowledge passed between them, heavy and shared. They will look for you, she said softly, though she knew he wouldn't understand. The settlers, they will look. He nodded slowly, as if he did understand the danger, the inevitability. His gaze was steady. He had faced death before. The forced intimacy of their situation, the shared secret, the quiet tasks performed side by side, began to chip away at the walls around Clara's heart. Kaelen was not the savage she had been taught to fear. He was a man of quiet dignity, capable of both fierce strength and gentle patience. He was wounded, relying on her, and his vulnerability somehow reached past her defenses in a way nothing else had since Thomas died. And she, in turn, was showing him a different face than the one he must have known from other white settlers, a face of mercy, perhaps even kindness. They were 2 solitary figures, adrift in a vast, indifferent world, finding a strange, precarious harbor in each other's presence. It was a connection built not on shared history or culture, but on shared vulnerability and a fundamental human decency that transcended the boundaries drawn by fear and prejudice. One afternoon, while Kaelen was outside chopping wood, Clara saw Ryder approaching from the direction of the settlement. Her blood ran cold. It was Mr. Brody, a stern, unforgiving man who lived about 10 miles away. He rarely ventured this far out unless he had a purpose. And that purpose was unlikely to be neighborly. Panic seized her. Kaelen. He was outside, exposed. She ran to the door. Kaelen, she called, her voice sharp with urgency. Hide, Ryder coming. He looked up, saw the fear in her face, followed her gaze to the approaching dust cloud. His eyes narrowed, instantly alert. He dropped the axe and moved with surprising speed despite his leg, disappearing around the back of the cabin, towards the small copse of trees near the creek. Clara slammed the door shut, her heart pounding. She tried to compose herself, smooth her apron, make the cabin look as normal, as undisturbed as possible. She grabbed a bucket and hurried towards the creek, trying to appear busy, as if the approaching rider was merely an interruption to her chores. Mr. Brody rode up, a grim expression on his face. He dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the area, missing nothing. He was a man who saw the world in stark terms, good and evil, us and them. And them, for him, included anyone who didn't fit neatly into his narrow view of frontier life. Ms. Clara, he said, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. Mr. Brody, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Didn't expect anyone out this way. Saw some tracks near the edge of your property line a few days back, he said, ignoring her pleasantry. Big tracks, looked like moccasins. His eyes fixed on her, hard and accusatory. Clara's stomach twisted. They had seen the tracks when they left Kaelen. Or maybe after she had cut him down. Tracks? On the prairie? There's all sorts of tracks out here, Mr. Brody. These were particular tracks, Ms. Clara, and there were other signs. We had ourselves a bit of trouble last week, lost some livestock. He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. And we captured one of 'em. Had him tied up, planning to make an example. Clara swallowed hard. An example? I left him tied to a tree near the old cottonwoods, but when we went back, he was gone. His gaze was piercing now, trying to find a flicker of guilt or knowledge in her eyes. Seems someone cut him loose. The accusation wasn't spoken aloud, but it hung between them, sharp as a drawn knife. He was searching her face, her property, for any sign. Kaelen. Was he hidden well enough? Why would I know anything about that, Mr. Brody? She asked, trying to sound calm, reasonable. I keep to myself out here. Don't see much of anyone. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, though it lost none of its steel. Folks talk, Ms. Clara. You out here alone. Seems strange, a woman managing on her own. Some folks figure maybe you got help from places you shouldn't. The prejudice was layered, not just against Kaelen's people, but against her, a woman alone, surviving, defying expectations. Her isolation made her suspect, her independence seen as unnatural, perhaps even dangerous. I manage just fine, she said, meeting his gaze directly, willing her knees not to tremble. Thomas built this place strong. I can take care of myself. He gave a low, humorless chuckle. Can you now? Word is, these savages are bold when they get desperate. A lone woman, easy pickings. He was watching her closely, looking for her reaction, hoping to frighten her into confessing, or perhaps just confirming his suspicions. If you've seen anything or harbored anyone, Ms. Clara, it's your duty to say so, for the safety of the community. Community. The word felt hollow coming from him, a man whose community offered her only suspicion and judgment. I haven't seen anyone, Mr. Brody, she repeated, her voice firm. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have chores. She turned slightly, indicating her intention to dismiss him. He didn't move for a moment, his gaze lingering on her face, then sweeping towards the cabin, the trees. She could feel his suspicion like a physical weight. Was he looking towards the cottonwoods where Kaelen had been tied, towards the creek where Kaelen might be hidden? Finally, with a grunt, he turned back towards his horse. Keep your eyes open, Ms. Clara, he warned. There's trouble about, and trouble tends to find folks who aren't careful about who they associate with. The implied threat hung in the air. He mounted his horse, gave her one last hard look, and rode away. Clara watched him go, not daring to move until he was a distant speck. Only when he was gone, swallowed by the vastness, did the breath she'd been holding escape in a shaky gasp. Her legs felt like water. She waited a few minutes, scanning the empty prairie, before risking a low call. Kaelen, he's gone. A moment later, he emerged from the trees, silent and watchful as ever. He came back towards the cabin, his eyes questioning. Settler, she explained, gesturing towards the direction Brody had gone. He was looking for you. She mimed being tied, then cutting free. He knows someone helped you. She pointed to herself, then to the cabin, shook her head. I told him nothing. He understood. He looked at her, his eyes conveying a depth of understanding and gravity. He knew the danger she had just faced, and the danger she continued to face by protecting him. He nodded slowly, a gesture that held both gratitude and a shared weight of consequence. The encounter with Brody underlined the fragility of their situation, the ever-present threat of discovery. It also solidified something between them. They were in this together now. Her act of kindness had bound her to him, not with ropes, but with shared risk. Days turned into a week, then two. Kaelen's leg wound healed enough for him to move more freely. He was teaching her more Lakota words now, patiently repeating them until she got them right. She taught him more English. They built a rudimentary bridge across the language barrier, word by word, gesture by gesture. She learned a little of his life, pieced together from gestures and the few words they shared. He had a family, a wife, maybe children. He pointed to the sky, then swept his hand across the land, indicating his people moved with the seasons. He was a warrior, a hunter. He drew pictures in the dirt, a buffalo, a horse, figures riding. He drew a picture of her cabin, then a line around it, then a circle around her and him inside it. A boundary. Protection? He asked about her life too, with his eyes, his gestures. She showed him the small wooden crossgrave marker on the hill behind the cabin. Thomas. She pointed to the empty spaces in her life. The silence, the loneliness. He seemed to understand. He looked at the marker, then back at her, his expression quiet with sympathy. He had known loss too. It was a universal language, the quiet ache of grief. The prejudice of the outside world felt increasingly distant, irrelevant, within the small, guarded circle of her cabin and the surrounding land. Here he was not an enemy warrior, and she was not a strange, vulnerable widow. They were simply Kaelen and Clara, two people whose paths had collided in a moment of crisis, finding an unexpected resonance in each other's presence. The forbidden felt less like a danger and more like a truth. But the outside world pressed in eventually. A few nights later, the sound of horses and shouting jolted Clara awake. Louder this time, closer. Brody was back. And he hadn't come alone. She scrambled out of bed, her heart hammering. Kaelen was already awake, standing by the window, his body tense, listening. The light from their fire must have been visible. There was no time to hide him outside. "They're here," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Kaelen turned, his eyes blazing in the firelight. He looked towards the axe leaning by the door. He was still recovering, his leg not fully healed, but the warrior was awake in him now, ready to fight. "No," Clara said, reaching out, laying a hand on his arm. His muscle was hard under her touch. "Too many. You cannot fight them all." He looked at her, then back at the axe, then around the small cabin. There was nowhere to go, no escape. The shouting grew louder. Heavy footsteps approached the cabin, then a loud, demanding pounding on the door. "Ms. Clara, we know he's in there. Open the door." It was Brody's voice, harsh and unforgiving. Clara looked at Kaelen, her mind racing. They knew. How? Had someone seen him, found a clue, or had Brody just been waiting, watching, his suspicion solidifying into certainty? Kaelen met her gaze, his face grim. He gripped her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, a silent communication passing between them, acknowledgement of the danger, of her courage, of the bond they had forged in secrecy. She couldn't hand him over, not after everything, not after she had cut him loose, tended his wounds, shared her meager fire and food. It was impossible. It would be a betrayal of the deepest kind, a betrayal of the fragile humanity they had found together. "Go," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. She pushed him gently towards the back room, the small storage area. "Hide, under the floorboards." Thomas had built a small hidden compartment there, for valuables, or perhaps in case of trouble. Kaelen hesitated, looking from her face to the door, where the pounding grew more insistent. He was a warrior. Hiding went against his nature. He wanted to stand and fight, even wounded, even outnumbered. "Go," she urged, her voice louder now, her hand on his chest, pushing him towards the back. "Please, trust me." His dark eyes searched hers for a moment, then, with a reluctant nod, he turned and slipped into the back room. Clara heard the quiet scrape as he lifted the loose floorboards and lowered himself into the dark space below. She quickly replaced the boards, threw a blanket over them, trying to make it look undisturbed. The pounding on the door escalated, threatening to splinter the wood. "Open up, Ms. Clara, or we'll break it down." Clara straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath. Her fear hadn't vanished, but a fierce, protective anger had risen to meet it. They wouldn't take him, not from her. She walked towards the door, lifted the heavy wooden bar, and pulled it open. 4 men stood outside, silhouetted against the dark night, rifles glinting in the faint light. Brody was in front, his face set in a hard mask of righteous anger. "Took you long enough, Ms. Clara," Brody said, stepping forward. The other men fanned out slightly, their eyes scanning the doorway, peering into the dim cabin. "It's the middle of the night, Mr. Brody," Clara said, trying to sound annoyed rather than terrified. "What do you want?" "We want the savage," another man, gruff-looking, said. "We know you're hiding him." "Hiding who?" Clara feigned ignorance. "I told Mr. Brody, I haven't seen anyone." Brody pushed past her, entering the cabin, his rifle held loosely at the ready. The others followed, their boots heavy on her floor. They spread out, searching the single room, their gazes sharp, suspicious. "He's not here," Clara said, following Brody, trying to keep him away from the back room. "He's here," Brody insisted, his eyes narrowed. "Someone cut him loose, someone hereabouts, and you're the only one for miles who didn't join the search." "I was tending my place," she said. "I don't get involved in settlers' business." "This is settlers' business," Brody snapped. "This is about safety, About us against them. You understand, Ms. Clara? He moved towards the back room. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. There's nothing in there but storage, she said quickly, stepping in front of him. Old blankets, tools. Brody stopped, looking at her face, then at the doorway to the small room. His suspicion was a palpable force. Get out of my way, Ms. Clara. No, she said, planting her feet. It was a small word, but felt monumental. A defiance born of desperation and a sudden fierce loyalty to the man hidden beneath her floorboards. Brody stared at her, surprised by her resistance. Then his face hardened. He raised his rifle slightly. You aiding an enemy, Ms. Clara? That's a dangerous road to walk. He was tied to a tree, left to die, she cried, the words bursting out of her, raw and impassioned. He was wounded. I gave him water. What kind of people leave a man, any man, to die like that? He's not a man. He's a savage, the gruff man behind Brody spat. He has a name, Clara said, her voice trembling with anger and fear. Kaelen. He helped me chop wood. He taught me words. He is a man. Her defense, so unexpected and fervent, seemed to momentarily stun the men. They hadn't anticipated this quiet woman raising her voice, defending one of them. Brody recovered quickly, his face contorted with rage. You've been corrupted. Living out here alone has made you weak in the head. Step aside. He moved to push past her. Just as he did, a floorboard creaked loudly from the back room. Every head snapped towards the sound. Brody's eyes widened in furious confirmation. There, he yelled. He's in there. Get him. The men surged forward. Clara cried out, lunging to block the narrow doorway, but she was a small woman against 4 determined men. Brody shoved her aside roughly. She stumbled back, hitting the wall. The men rushed into the back room. There was a moment of scuffling, grunts of effort. Then, Kaelen emerged, moving with surprising speed and agility despite his leg. He hadn't gone deep into the hiding spot, but stayed ready. He was unarmed, but in his hands he held something heavy, something he must have grabbed from the storage. It was Thomas's old, rusted shovel. Not an axe, not a rifle, but a tool of the land, a symbol of the hard life Clara lived. He faced the men, his chest heaving, his eyes narrowed into slits. He held the shovel like a weapon, ready to defend himself and to defend her. He spoke then, a guttural cry in his own language, a challenge, a fierce declaration. Kaelen, Clara cried, scrambling to her feet. The cabin was small, the space confined. The men hesitated, rifles pointed but wary of the confined space and Kaelen's readiness. Brody raised his rifle, taking aim. Drop the shovel, savage, he yelled. Kaelen didn't move. He was ready to die here, defending this space, defending her. Clara reacted instinctively. Driven by fear for Kaelen, by the injustice of it all, she grabbed the first thing she could reach, a heavy iron skillet hanging by the fireplace. With a wordless cry, she swung it with all her might at the nearest man, not Brody, but the one next to him. The skillet connected with a sickening thud against the man's head. He staggered back with a cry, dropping his rifle. The distraction was enough. Kaelen moved, swinging the shovel in a wide arc. The heavy blade caught Brody's rifle, knocking it aside with a clatter. Brody yelled in surprise and pain. Kaelen followed through, swinging the shovel again, forcing the men to scatter back from the narrow doorway. Chaos erupted in the small cabin. Rifles were clumsy in the tight space. Kaelen used the shovel, his body a blur of movement despite his limp, parrying blows, forcing the men back out into the main room. Clara, armed with the skillet, stood behind him, her face set in fierce determination, ready to strike again. The men, disoriented by the cramped space, the unexpected resistance from both Kaelen and Clara, stumbled back. One man tripped over a stool. Kaelen used the moment, swinging the shovel hard. It connected with another man's shoulder, he cried out, clutching his arm. Brody, recovering, leveled his pistol. But Kaelen was faster. He swung the shovel down with tremendous force, aiming not at the man but at the heavy iron pot hanging over the fire. The shovel struck the pothook. The pot, filled with water heated for tea, crashed down, sending steaming water splashing across the hearth and floor. The sudden heat and steam disoriented the men further. Kaelen seized the opportunity. Go, he yelled, his voice raw, grabbing Clara's arm. Outside. He pulled her towards the door. The element of surprise, the confined space, her unexpected ferocity, and Kaelen's desperate strength had given them a chance. They burst out of the cabin into the cold night air. The men stumbled out behind them, coughing in the steam, regaining their bearings. But Kaelen and Clara already had a head start. Kaelen pulled her towards the cover of the trees near the creek, moving as fast as his injured leg allowed. Shots rang out, cracking through the night. Bullets whizzed past them, thudding into the trees. They ran, stumbling over the rough ground, the adrenaline pumping through their veins. They reached the cover of the small copse, plunging into the darkness between the trees. They could hear the men shouting, crashing through the brush behind them. Kaelen pulled Clara down behind a thick clump of bushes, shielding her body with his own. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving. He held her close, his grip tight. She could feel his heart hammering against her, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. The shouting grew closer. They were searching, spreading out. Kaelen whispered something in Lakota against her hair. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, protective, urgent. He shifted, peering through the leaves. The sound of footsteps grew louder, coming towards their hiding spot. There was no escape now. They were trapped. Kaelen tightened his arm around her, his body tensing. He was ready to face them, to fight until the end to protect her. Suddenly, a voice, closer than the others, called out, "Brody, over here, looks like they went towards the ridge." The footsteps turned, receding slightly, joining the others who were moving away from the creek towards the higher ground. They listened, barely daring to breathe, until the sounds of the pursuit faded into the distance. They were safe for the moment. The men had been thrown off course, heading towards the ridge where there was nowhere to hide. Still, Kaelen held her, his muscles slowly relaxing, but his grip remaining firm. The crisis had passed, but the closeness remained. Pressed together in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of the night, the barrier between them felt thinner than ever before. He finally loosened his hold, but didn't release her completely. He turned his head, his face close to hers in the darkness. She could feel his breath on her cheek. He raised a hand, gently touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw. "Clara," he whispered, her name soft, unfamiliar on his tongue, yet imbued with a new depth of meaning. "Kaelen," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. He leaned closer, and in the quiet darkness, he kissed her. It was a tentative kiss at first, a brushing of lips, questioning. Then it deepened, a release of all the tension, the fear, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. It was a kiss born of shared danger, of protection given and received, of finding unexpected warmth in a cold, harsh world. It tasted of dust and fear, and the undeniable truth of their connection. It was forbidden. It was real. When they finally pulled apart, they remained close, foreheads touching, breathing each other's air. The shouts of the distant search party were a stark reminder of the world they had defied, the line they had crossed. They stayed hidden until dawn, the cold seeping into their bones, but the quiet warmth of their bond holding the chill at bay. When the first light began to appear, painting the sky again, the sounds of the search were gone. The men had given up for the night. They emerged from the trees, stiff and weary. The cabin stood silent and dark, a small, violated space on the prairie. The door hung ajar, the contents of the main room disturbed, the floor wet near the hearth. It felt different now, no longer just her refuge, but a place they had defended together. "We cannot stay here," Clara said, the reality sinking in. Brody and the others knew. They knew she had hidden him, fought for him. Her solitary life was over. She was no longer just a quiet widow. She was an accomplice, an outcast in the eyes of the community, and Kaelen was still a hunted man. Kaelen nodded. He looked towards the west, the direction of his people, then back at her. He touched his chest, then hers, then swept his hand towards the west. He wanted her to come with him. Clara looked at her cabin, the place that had been her world, her prison, her sanctuary for the past 3 years, the grave on the hill, Thomas. Everything she knew, everything she was tied to this small piece of land. But that life was shattered now. The community would not forgive this. And staying here meant Kaelen would eventually be found. She looked at Kaelen, at the quiet strength in his eyes, the warrior who had offered her protection, the man who had seen past the prejudices of his world and hers. He was offering her a new path, a dangerous, uncertain path, but one away from the judgment and isolation she had known. A path towards, what? His people? A life she couldn't imagine? The future was a vast, unknown territory, as daunting as the prairie itself, but facing it alone felt impossible now. Facing it with him, the fear was still there, but alongside it was a nascent hope, a feeling of connection more profound than any she had known since her loss. She looked at the grave one last time, a silent farewell to the life that was. Then she turned to Kaelen, her gaze steady. "Yes," she said, the single word a leap of faith across a chasm of difference and danger. "Yes, Kaelen, I will go with you." His eyes softened, a burden lifting from his shoulders. He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. They gathered what little they could carry, some food, blankets, Thomas's rifle and ammunition she had hidden away, the skillet that had proven surprisingly useful. They left the cabin standing, a silent monument to the unexpected events that had transpired within its walls. As the sun rose higher, they walked away from her home, leaving behind the ghosts of the past and the threat of the present. Kaelen, favoring his healing leg, moved with his quiet warrior's grace. Clara walked beside him, the unfamiliar weight of the rifle in her hand, the feel of his hand in hers a steady anchor. They were two figures, stark against the vast prairie, moving towards the west, towards the unknown. They carried their histories, their griefs, the marks of their separate worlds. But they also carried something new, something fragile and fiercely protected. A bond forged in forbidden kindness, tested by fire and prejudice, and sealed with a kiss under the watchful, silent stars. It was the beginning of a different kind of story, one written not in the rules of their respective peoples, but in the shared language of the heart, seeking a place where belonging was found not in fitting in, but in finding each other. The prairie stretched before them, immense and challenging. But for the first time in a long time, Clara did not feel entirely alone. She was going west, with a man who was once her enemy, towards a life she couldn't foresee, carrying the quiet, dangerous hope of a love that had bloomed in the unlikeliest of places.